How rich are you? And how much do you need to be in the top 1% of richest people in the world?
I'm rich.
The numbers will surprise you. In this video, we'll take you through some of the most interesting findings in the largest global study on wealth, examining not only personal wealth, but also national and regional economies. If you want to know where money, and implicitly power, is flowing, and also want to anticipate future economic shifts, you have to watch this video. The report that we're concentrating on today is the Global Wealth Report for 2023. It's the 14th edition of this flagship report by Credit Suisse. This report, however, is co-authored by UBS. Why? Well, as some of you might remember, UBS acquired its fallen rival Credit Suisse last year for a bargain $3.25 billion in a rescue orchestrated by the Swiss authorities to avert a banking sector meltdown. Of course, these details are omitted in the report's introductory remarks, which were, so we're told, authored by Iqbal Khan, the president of UBS Global Wealth Management. Instead, the PR spin celebrates the uniqueness of this report, since, for the first time ever, it's combined efforts between UBS and Credit Suisse. Who needs the fine print anyway? Regardless of the context, this is an impressive report. The authors crunch David Goggins levels of data to compile it and to bring us some fascinating insights about the state of wealth in the world today, which I'll get to in just a minute. But first, I have to point out two things that grind my gears about the intro. First, Khan claims, and I quote, "It is private wealth that will lead to the funding needed to create diverse, sustainable societies." Khan is putting the BS in UBS here, pandering to the uber-rich, implicitly portraying them as benevolent saviors, rather than, in some cases, architects of many of the problems that we face. More irritating still, Khan, or his dude bro ghostwriter, writes, and I quote, "At UBS, wealth management isn't just one thing we do, it's who we are." What does that mean anyway? Cringe quotes aside, the report is otherwise impressive and very thoughtful, so let's jump into some of the findings. First up, some bad news. Global wealth declined in 2022. That's right, global wealth fell 2.4% to $454.4 trillion, while wealth per adult dropped 3.6% to $84,718 in 2022. These are the latest available figures the bank has. So to understand why wealth declined in 2022, it's important to look at what happened in 2020 and 2021. More specifically, how governments responded to COVID. To refresh your memory, wealthy governments, for the most part, introduced stimulus packages to prevent their economies from grinding to a halt. The US, for instance, introduced 3 packages that were estimated to have cost the government $16 trillion, or about 90% of GDP. At one point, the government simply just gave its citizens $1,200 per person plus $500 per child. Meanwhile, interest rates were low, which encouraged borrowing and economic activity. So what were the consequences of these policies? Well, one positive side effect of this was increased liquidity that caused, or at least greatly spurred on, the last crypto bull market. More money in people's bank accounts, combined with the lack of spending opportunities caused by COVID restrictions, resulted in a surge of capital into crypto, pushing prices of major assets to their all-time highs. But the real impact of the COVID-era stimulus packages became evident in mid-2021, as inflation levels across the US started rising at an alarming rate, as you can see from the chart here. A similar story was playing out across the OECD, in other words, rich countries, at the same time. In fact, OECD inflation in 2022 was more than double its 2021 level, 9.6% compared with 4%, reaching its highest annual average rate since 1988. Why did this happen? Well, as basic economics dictates, when there is more money in people's pockets, or in finance speak, greater liquidity in the economy, inflation becomes more likely. And what do central banks do to combat this? That's right, they take money out of the economy by increasing interest rates and therefore the cost of borrowing. Why is this context important? Well, it helps to understand why global wealth declined for the first time since 2008. As the Global Wealth Report puts it, higher inflation, increased interest rates, and currency depreciation are the three factors that explain this recent drop in global wealth. This table puts it into context. As you can see, when inflation is taken into account, real global household wealth grew on average between 2 and 9% so far this century. The two exceptions were 2008, which saw a decline of 7%, and 2022, which was about half of that. Okay, that's the first finding. Overall wealth declined in 2022. But not across the board. Finding 2 is that most of the money lost was in richer countries. North America and Europe lost a whopping $10.9 trillion combined. Meanwhile, China and the Asia-Pacific area also saw a drop of about $3.5 trillion. At the same time, India and Africa made a bit of money, and Latin America made a lot of money. Based on the report figures, the region actually got richer by $2.4 trillion, which is a huge 18.6% increase. Because of the relatively strong performance by weaker economies, overall global inequality fell. As you can see from this graph, global inequality has been broadly on a downtrend since the start of the century. The wealthiest 5% and top 10% of the planet are controlling relatively less wealth than they did before. However, the statistic narrows when it comes to the top 1%. They also control less as a proportion of the global wealth than they did in 2000s, but only slightly. In any case, finding 2 is a positive one. Globally, inequality has improved, but the world is still staggeringly unequal. Let's take North America and Europe, for instance. Combined, they have just 16% of the world's adult population, yet they hold a whopping 56% of all household wealth in the world. Also, when you look at wealth distribution within nations, you'll see that inequality is, in fact, growing.
I was trapped inside a cage made out of the daily grind.
I was so unfulfilled. I felt like a blank sheet of A4 paper.
Something was missing from my life, but I didn't know what.
But then I found what I'd been missing.
The Coin Bureau deals page was the answer to my prayers.
It had everything I needed to make me complete.
Exchange sign-up bonuses of up to $50,000.
The biggest discounts on the best hardware wallets.
Trading fee discounts of up to 60% on the best crypto exchanges.
Exclusive altcoin alpha.
Thank you, Coin Bureau, for bringing me back to life.
And that brings us to our next finding. Here, the authors turn to Gini coefficient to determine wealth distribution within countries. The Gini coefficient, in case you're asked this ever in a pub quiz, was named after the Italian statistician Corrado Gini. Corrado also happened to be a fan of eugenics, but the less said on that, the better. In any case, the index he's named after ranges from 0% to 100%, where 0 represents perfect inequality and 100 means complete inequality. So looking at wealth inequality, this table in the report gives us a snapshot of how things stand within 14 different markets. In all of these countries, wealth inequality is pretty high, and in some, it's through the roof. Usually you'll see the top 1% holding on to about 30 to 35% of all wealth, and the top 10% have between 60 and 65%. If the Gini value is around 70, that's on the lower side, but anything over 80 shows really high inequality. When we take the longer view, from 2000 to 2020, it looks like inequality within countries generally went up. In fact, in 10 of the 14 markets, the Gini coefficient was lower in 2020 than it was in 2000. And in some countries, the inequality levels are truly staggering. Take Brazil, for instance. Just 1% of Brazilians hold nearly half of the country's wealth. I don't know about you, but those images of luxurious villas adjacent to Flávola's in São Paulo, they spring to mind. All right, we'll get to the rich list in just a second so you can see how you measure up. But first, we'll reveal what the report says about wealth distribution across ethnicities and genders. Unfortunately, on this point, the report only has data on the US, so Finding 4 relates exclusively to there and nowhere else. According to the 2019 survey on consumer finance, the median wealth of African Americans is only about 12.8% of what is owned by, and I quote, non-Hispanic Caucasians, which must be the most roundabout way of saying white I've ever heard. For Hispanics, it's a little bit better, but still low at 19.2%. Now, when it comes to income rather than wealth, the story is somewhat better, but still staggering. According to the same source, African Americans earn 58.4% and Hispanics 59% of what non-Hispanic Caucasians earn. When it comes to gender, we have to go back to 2018 to get the latest figures from Credit Suisse. That year, the Global Wealth Report showed that in the wealthy OECD countries, women's wealth was typically between 65 to 80% of men's wealth. Unfortunately, there is no data for non-OECD countries, but given the fact that employment opportunities are vastly better for women in OECD countries, you can imagine the figure is significantly lower outside the rich world. Right, on to Finding 5. And this is where you come in. The report reveals different wealth bands in the world and shows us what percentage of the world is included in each band. If your net worth is $10,000 or below, you're among the 53% of people in the lowest band. If your net worth exceeds this, you're richer than over half of all adults worldwide. Now, if your wealth is between $10,000 and $100,000, you're among 1.8 billion people who make up this band. And if you have over $33,573, you're among the wealthiest in this band. Typically, this band includes the middle classes in the developing countries. So what if you're above this? Well, if you have more than $100,000 to your name, but you haven't quite hit the Millionaires Club, you're in what the authors call the upper middle segment. This group includes 642 million people. Together, they own 39.4% of the global wealth, which is over 3 times their share of the adult population. This bracket typically includes the middle class in developed nations. And finally, if your wealth exceeds $1 million, congratulations, you're a high net worth individual and in the top 1.1% of adults globally. Now, if you're in the Millionaires Club, you're part of a group of nearly 60 million people who hold 46% of global wealth. This number represents a 5-fold increase since 2000, due to a combination of not only increased wealth, but also inflation. After all, because of inflation, $1 million today is not the same as $1 million in 2000s. In fact, the authors note that 4.4 million of the 60 million people in this bracket are so-called fake millionaires. These people, they explain, only became millionaires because of the impact of inflation. Fake millionaire or not, this is a very elite group and one that is expanding rapidly. In fact, UBS estimates that there will be 86 million millionaires in the world by 2027. Now, you might be wondering how many of these millionaires got their wealth from crypto. UBS doesn't go into the details, but a report by Henley and Partners earlier this year, which we covered in a previous video, which I'll link below, does. In H&P's report, the world's first crypto wealth report, the authors state that there are 88,200 crypto millionaires worldwide, with just under half holding their fortune in Bitcoin. It will be interesting to see how these numbers change over the next few years, particularly if we're back in a bull run. In terms of wealth brackets, the UBS report goes one step further. The authors note that there are nearly 9,490 adults with wealth above $100 million at the end of 2022, of which 7,020 are worth more than 500 million USD. But from our perspective, this data only tells us part of the story. It doesn't account for relative wealth. For instance, if you're watching this from a very wealthy country, you might be thinking that $1 million isn't actually that high a threshold to be joining the 1%. In fact, if you're a property owner in a rich city like Hong Kong, San Francisco, Sydney, and others, you're effectively a millionaire since the median house price is over $1 million. So then the question becomes, how much money do you need to have to be in the top 1% in the country you live in? Thankfully, data from Knight Frank, a leading global real estate consultancy, provides an answer. As you can see from this graphic, to join the 1% in Monaco, you need to be worth an over eye-watering $12 million. In Switzerland, it's about half of that figure, while in New Zealand, Australia, and the US, you'll need to have over $5 million to your name. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have over $20,000 in Kenya or $60,000 in the Philippines, you're in the top 1%. Now, that's the 1%, but what about the most elite of all? What about the billionaires? For insights into this select bracket, we need to turn to Visual Capitalist and their fantastic graphic. According to their findings, there are 3,311 billionaires worldwide, and they collectively have $11.8 trillion in global wealth. Just 20 people have a net worth of over $50 billion. For context, the world's economy is around $105 trillion. Unsurprisingly, the largest proportion of the uber-rich live in North America, with New York City hosting the largest number of billionaires in the world. 130 billionaires live in NYC, just ahead of Hong Kong with 114. Overall, the number of billionaires in China is less than half of that of the US. What's interesting here is that while the number of billionaires is quite heavily concentrated in the US and China, when it comes to all individuals with over $50 million to their name, the proportion shifts markedly. In fact, if you look at this graphic from the UBS report, you'll see the number of high net worth individuals in the US is over 4 times that of China and ellipses any other country. This suggests that the wealth among the uber-rich in China is more concentrated than in the US. I'll leave a link to the Visual Capitalist findings in the description below, in case you want to dig into the details a little bit more. Right, so with all of this talk about the uber-rich, it's easy to feel inadequate and unsatisfied. This isn't helped by the ridiculous viral content on social media. But before you get down on yourself, remind yourself that money doesn't necessarily bring you happiness. That's not just some idle saying, it's backed up by some pretty rigorous research. You might be familiar with the famous 2010 Stanford study by Dan Kaigman and Angus Deaton, 2 Nobel Prize winners. They concluded that the amount you earn definitely increases your happiness, but only to a certain threshold. Above that threshold, after your basic needs are well and truly met, the impact of your wealth on happiness diminishes to the point of insignificance. The figure in the 2010 study is $75,000 and takes data from US citizens. Adjusted for inflation, the figure is about $105,500 today. However, Dan has since revised his findings in light of other research on happiness. Together with 2 academics from the University of Pennsylvania, he concluded that for most people, there is a correlation between wealth and happiness. But if you're miserable, more money won't solve your problems. Your mood might improve as your salary increases to $100,000, but above this threshold, it likely won't make a blind bit of difference. We could go on and on about wealth and happiness, but maybe this is a topic for another day. If you're interested in us covering this in the future videos, let us know in the comments. Also, tell us what you thought about the findings in this report. Did those figures surprise you? How does it make you feel about your own wealth? We hope at least we help put some things into context. If you're craving some more crypto content, be sure to check out Coin Bureau on X, TikTok, and Instagram. Also, be sure to check out our recently launched Discord server. There you'll be able to interact with the team and find out what coins and tokens we're all excited about. And if you want some top alpha insights into our crypto investments, portfolios, and much more besides, be sure to join the Coin Bureau Club. Oh, and don't forget to check out the Coin Bureau Deals page, where you'll find the best deals on hardware wallets and crypto exchanges around, including up to $50,000 in sign-up bonuses. All right, I'm Jessica. Thank you for watching. And remember, at Coin Bureau, crypto videos aren't just what we do, it's who we are.